exactly halfway, but we're close to halfway. You're all still with us, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's what I was hoping to hear. I did see some folks who continued to head on closer to the Bushbeck line, and I was beginning to wonder if we had demoralized folks that they really needed that rallying point already. But I'm glad to see that you're all still with us. All right, are we closed up in the back? I believe so. We're good? Okay. Great. So when Frank left off, he was talking a little bit about the woods down closer to Gold Run, largely from a Union perspective of cover and a Confederate perspective of a new artillery target. But we also have some other Confederate perspectives. Those of you who were with us on Thursday might remember this one. The woods around Gold Run acted like a strainer on the retreating 11th Corps. One Southerner wrote, this is great, the lean and lesser Dutchmen escaped while we secured the fat ones. Not very nice terms, but apparently it was a common feeling because another wrote, we captured piles of fat knapsacks and piles of fatter Dutchmen. But no matter their size, these men had a tough time getting through the woods. We will all soon experience the difficulty of making it through the woods. Happily, we haven't had too much of a struggle of that yet, but keep that in mind as we continue on after we press forward through the next few stops. Once we encounter the woods, just what a difficult experience it is to make it through. Once they are able to make it through the woods, they're greeted just in this area here, probably out in front of the bulk of you, closer in toward Wilderness Church, which stands just off in front of all of us. You might be able to see the cemetery from here. Closer into this area, by Oliver Otis Howard, who's now made an appearance on the field. Howard has just returned to his corps to find it in a complete rout. He rides into his retreating men and tries to rally the troops. He tucks a flag under the stump of one of his arms. He had lost an arm in the Peninsula Campaign, and so he tucks the flag under the stump, brandishes a pistol in the other hand, and yelled for his men to stop, to rally, to stand with him. Are you going to rally with him? Maybe it depends on what he says. His war cry at this point is, halt, halt, I'm ruined, I'm ruined. It's maybe not the most inspiring war cry he could have come up with. James Peabody is on the scene. He's watching Howard and decided that he was completely confused and bewildered. He added, none of us knew or cared where he went. So here is Howard on the field as a corps commander, but his effectiveness as a corps commander is essentially none, because his men are ignoring him, because he isn't setting the best example for them. He, in fact, at this point, is presenting quite a comical picture to us today. But if we stand in Oliver Otis Howard's shoes for just a moment, we'll see we've got a commander who's fairly new to his command, doesn't get along well with his troops, and now, because he didn't heed certain warnings, because his headquarters didn't believe there was any problems, his corps is in a complete rout. He's got a disaster on his hands that he now has to try to mitigate. It's unfortunate that his first thoughts turn to himself, but at the same time, his fate rests pretty solidly with his corps' fate. Howard's name is going to be forever associated with the 11th Corps, which is going to be forever associated after this battle with the nickname of the Flying Dutchman. Howard is simply their commander. But what can he do? He can't undo his actions. He can't recreate a defensive line here that wasn't. How can he remedy the situation? If I were him, I would think of a flag, a rallying cry, perhaps with better chosen words, and a pistol shouting in the air seems to me like a pretty decent method. He was desperate. He wrote that he wanted to die. It was the only time I ever weakened that way in my life, before or since. But that night I did all in my power to remedy the mistake, and I sought death everywhere I could find an excuse to go on the field. That gives us a slightly different perspective than completely confused and bewildered. This is a man trying to fix a mistake that he fully realizes that he made, if need be, at the sacrifice of his life. It also tells us how much his reputation actually means to him, if he's perhaps more willing to die on the field and to be remembered as someone who was dying in the act of trying to save his troops, trying to rally his troops, than as someone who just utterly failed. I hope none of us in this crowd have ever reached a point where it seems to us that the better option is to die in a blaze of glory than to continue to live and try to struggle through whatever situation it is that we're in. But I believe that's where Oliver Otis Howard was 150 years ago on May 2nd. But he did not succeed in either the quest to simply be remembered as someone who went down for his troops, or in rallying his troops, and Howard is largely ignored as his troops saw the practicality of the situation and continued to stream right on past him. But he continues to make an effort. He and Colonel Joseph Dickinson of Hooker's staff, some of you might remember Dickinson if you were with us yesterday for a program, I think, Ordeal of the Chancellors. I'm sure his name came up as he was trying to help the Chancellor ladies to escape. So he plays a role popping up here and there in the battle. But as Howard heads to his reserve artillery, Dickinson encourages him to fire on his men, to stop the rout, and to stop the Confederate advance. Should he fire? Will it work? If his rallying cry isn't enough, would firing on the men stop them? Howard says, "No, Colonel, I will never fire at my own men." Even in the midst of chaos, and even in the midst of his own ruin, and his own recognition of his own ruin, Howard will not sacrifice the lives of his men to try to stop them. Better to have men demoralized and alive at the end of the day than to have slaughtered your own men in an effort that may not even work. But as the men, the 11th Corps particularly, are running through this area, they are still, many of them, looking for a point to rally. And they'll find one. Some of you have already found the best rallying point in this area. But as they are trying to get organized, we'll have two regiments, the 27th Pennsylvania and the 29th New York, thrown ahead near the Wilderness Church. Again, just in front of us, you can see some of the white buildings in that area. They're thrown ahead near the church by Colonel Adolphus Bushbeck to buy time in order to present a firm line to those Confederates who are busy collecting fat Germans and fatter knapsacks. They succeed in momentarily throwing the Confederate momentum back on its heels, but the Confederates are simply too many in number and have a lot of momentum on their side. One of the men wrote, "The enemy literally swarmed on every side. After losing half their number, the two regiments were forced to retire." They'll break and run. One Confederate witness wrote, "The Yankees were strewn for 3 or 4 miles, some places very thick with them. Our men were mostly killed in charging batteries and breastworks, but were nothing to compare with the Yankees." That means that all the land that we've already walked to this point, and what we currently continue to stand on 150 years ago on Thursday, was strewn with the bodies of dead and wounded Union soldiers, killed in their retreat. But as I said before, many of the men are going to be looking for a place to rally, and they'll soon find it, and we're going to go stand with them. I have a different rallying cry, though, I promise.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so how far did the woods extend up the creek?
All right, the question is, how far did the woods extend up from the creek? So this is an interesting spot where the woods aren't exactly perpendicular with the road. So there are some areas in which they're close in by the creek, and things are a little bit thinner, I believe, around the church. Let me double check my map, as this is kind of a quick, or a confusing sort of place. So there's an open space around the church, but the woods are kind of thick, closer to the road and closer along in Gold Run. So where we're standing would have been open ground at the time, and the woods would have been more open around the church, but there are woods closer to the turnpike, modern-day Route 3, and closer in along the stream. So it's a good point at which to mention that there are openings, obviously, in the woods that we've been in so far, the Hawkins Farm being one of those openings, this area being another one of those openings, but many of these men are advancing through woods, and after a certain point where we will be advancing through the woods, that's all that was left to them. There were very few openings past that point.
So, what time
all right.
is it? 1863, about what time are we now?
What time are we? That's a great question. I bet Frank would know the answer. I don't know. Oh, he's already left. Never mind. Ask Frank at the next stop. He's got a better grasp on time.
The other side is around 6:37.
Yeah, he did.
6:37.
No, in fact, all this is happening so fast that there's not going to know for the next hour. The assumption is, it's the assumption that we've all had today, that you guys heard the artillery down in Hazel Grove and Fairview very plainly, didn't you? Well, the understanding is that all the sound out here would have carried down there as well. Chancellorsville should have heard about this stuff. But in truth, both Hazel Grove and Chancellorsville don't hear any of this. Now let's make it crazier. Robert E. Lee's another mile to the east. He'll hear this. So how does Hooker miss that? Acoustical shadow.
Acoustics are funny.
Yep, acoustics are very funny. The ground rolls. There's a number of ridges between us and Chancellorsville. We're on high ground. Lee's on high ground. But in between, sound is going to become engulfed. So as a result, there is a big, major acoustical shadow, probably the biggest acoustical shadow in all of American military history. Right here. Because the Union commander doesn't hear it, but the Confederate commander does. Now, at that point, Lee is going to step up his game. He's going to start attacking on his front because the Federals locked down so that they cannot bleed off reinforcements to deal with this new problem. And once that battle is brewing, you're not going to hear anything to the west. You're too consumed by the sound immediately in your presence. Yeah. Oh, your sound system is coming.
Standing on. Most of you are up on some fairly high ground, so look in front of you. You've got an excellent view. If you're looking for a place to rally, if you're someone who has been routed and you're looking for a good place to stand, you need look no further. And actually, this high ground had been utilized once before. Members of the 11th Corps had dug in here on May 1st. The problem is, if they dug in on May 1st, what direction are their earthworks facing? The other way. So they can't exactly utilize these earthworks, which are a pretty thin line of earthworks as it is, but it does mean they've got something. And when you need just about any amount of cover, any kind of rallying point that you can find, those earthworks become extremely valuable, however unsubstantial and however much they're facing in the exact wrong way. But here, we have two of our division commanders, Carl Schurz, who we talked about, especially back at the Hawkins farm, which was his headquarters, and Adolf von Steinwehr, who are directing their men into line here. To combine with the infantrymen trying to hold this high ground, we have closer in toward the turnpike, which you can see off to your left now, Captain Hubert Dogers, that is Old Leather Breeches, Battery I, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, coming into line. They're going to be firing double canister right there on the turnpike. Now, Doger had earlier conducted a personal reconnaissance ordered by Carl Schurz in order to scout for a post in case his guns came under attack from the rear. So Doger is one of the few people on the field who is very much expecting this attack and is very much prepared. He had spotted a large massing body of troops, had dashed back into the woods to report through a circuitous route, ended up at the Chancellor House back at Army headquarters, where he was turned away. He wasn't senior enough to report any of this to the Army commander, and who would have believed him anyway? So he goes back to the 11th Corps, where he finds that O.O. Howard had already gone south to the tussle down at Catherine Furnace. So who does Doger have to report this to? Who's going to listen to him that there is a large body of Confederates massing? He instead returns to his battery, told them to keep their horses close, and his well-founded caution proved to be extremely valuable. But you can imagine this man pacing back and forth between his guns closer into the turnpike, waiting, somewhat probably impatiently, because he knows that something is about to come. When the attack comes, he's prepared. And he, in many ways, I think, represents for us the tenacity of the 11th Corps. Most of the time, we think of the 11th Corps as breaking and running, and as we've seen so far today, that reputation holds. In many places, these men are running for their lives, but in some places, they're fully prepared for the engagement to come. Here on the infantry line, about 2,000 men in all, by the end of this, are able to rally here on the high ground. About 600 yards of line. Most of it is on this side of the turnpike where we stand. A little bit extends down on the other side. But again, let's look at the ground. If we had a strong force that was already entrenched here, that was already ready, we could have held this ground for a good amount of time. And how long will it hold with the Confederate momentum and with the Union forces already a little bit on edge as they stand here? Well, as the men are rallying here, as they're preparing to meet the Confederate attack sweeping toward them, General Schurz, who again has been lining his men up here, grabs a battle flag and tries to lead a charge. Who's with him?
Nobody.
None of you? So he goes forward, runs forward in the charge, and then he finds no one's following. So he comes back and tries again. Asks the men to rally, come forward, charge with him. He runs off, and again finds himself alone. After his third attempt, he gives up. It's one thing to rally on a point if you're a demoralized soldier, and it's another to rally and then charge. Schurz's failed charge tells us everything we need to know about the state of mind, maybe not everything, but most of what we need to know about the 11th Corps' state of mind 150 years ago on May 2nd. These men are badly broken and routed. So how well is your courage sticking at this point? It's hanging by a thread. You've got enough of it to stand here and fight, but do you have enough to charge forward? The men's answer of silence and emotion is a pretty resounding no. It's one thing to stand and meet an attack, it's another to run right into it. And there's really no need for these men to do so. The battle's headed straight for them. They don't have any need to come toward it. And soon enough, the Confederates will charge right into them. James Evans of the 145th Pennsylvania put it quite aptly in terms that all of us can understand 150 years later. He said, "They came upon our division like flies on a dead horse." That gives you a great visual. Here, however, Union forces made a stand. One man wrote that there by the turnpike Dover's cannon mowed a road clear through them. But again, the Confederates are able to close up and rush onward. Dover focuses on the infantry, though, attempting to stop the advance. And for a brief moment, there's success. Report heads back. Colonel Bushbeck succeeded in checking the progress of the enemy. Report from von Steinwehr. Did they? Well, just briefly. But in the end, it's only a pause for the Confederates to reform. And when they reform, you can bet they're going to attack stronger than ever. Another wave of attack will sweep forward once the Confederates have reorganized. 7 regimental officers will go down here. That means a loss of command structure as well as a major loss of life. Brigade Commander, Colonel Edward T.H. Warren is going to be wounded, shot in the shoulder. If you need an example of the Confederate exhaustion at this point, after they've marched 12 miles and have already attacked over at least a mile's worth of ground already, the superior officer doesn't know who to put in command, so they turn to a man who is past the point of exhaustion. His name is Samuel Thruston, and his staff officer has to lend him a horse so that he can actually command, because otherwise he was totally immobile. He was that tired from the marching all day, from attacking all day. How many of you are tired from our walk already? It's all right, you can raise your hand. All right, there's an honest soul. Imagine you just walked 12 miles, were formed up into a line. You started at 7 o'clock this morning, by the way, and now you've been attacking over how much ground? And by attacking, I largely mean a lot of running, a lot of adrenaline moving through you. These men are exhausted. Also up here, Colonel Elias Peisner, who's apparently the illegitimate son of the King of Bavaria, is killed while standing right behind his line. Reins in one hand, sword in the other, shouting, "Well done, my boys, give it to them," before he's struck in the chest by a bullet. Soon after he goes down, Lieutenant Francis Peisner, the colonel's brother, fell wounded in the leg. Lieutenant Charles F. Lewis, the colonel's brother-in-law, shot through the arm, all in a matter of minutes. So as we think about the casualties taken here, think about the loss. Each of these losses is going to have a ripple effect into families. This is a deep blow to one family. It's one thing to have many family members serving in a war, and in the course of the war to lose several of them. But here 3 go down in the matter of just a few minutes. Again, a great reminder that these losses will reverberate through time. But as the 11th Corps takes very heavy losses here in this fight, the Confederate forces are strong. They're attacking here in the front, but they're also beginning to lap around the flanks. When Jackson's line began, we said that his line stretched for about 2 miles in either direction. And I said that this line extends for about 600 yards. Now sure, Jackson's attack had to collapse in on itself to some degree to get this far. But it's still a very long line, and it outstretches this one. So if your courage is just barely holding, and you're standing here on this, your last defensive line, and you've got Confederates firing at you in front in extreme force, and then they begin to lap around on either side of you, how long are you going to hold on? So the battle hangs in the balance at this point. All the time that the 11th Corps has gained is extremely valuable. But how long are they going to be able to hold off against Jackson's great momentum? And to answer that question, we'll turn things over to Frank and move on just a little ways.
Let's go this way.
Is this a clear
What is? Yeah, all of these kind of, anything that's that little bit of
buttercup?
a lot of
What's the deal there? Hold that under your yellow. I think that like yeah.
Moving along really well. How you hold up?
Good.
Good. You ready to do this thing?
Right.
All right. Now, you'll notice that the hill that formed the spine of the Bushbeck line actually abruptly drops off on its north face. There is a tiny little hillock immediately off to your left front, and out there are the vestiges of 2 elements of regiments. There's 82nd Illinois folks that we were talking about, which I erroneously call Czechoslovakian. There is no Czechoslovakia. I've been reminded forcefully by several of you. You're absolutely right. Though I will say that this is probably the most cosmopolitan regiment in the entire Army. They have Germans, they have Czechs. They also have an entire company that's been raised and founded for a Jewish background out of Chicago. According to the regiment, they were an Israelitish company. So this is really one of the most worldly regiments that you'll ever find in the Army of the Potomac. They're going to be making a stand up on this little rise, along with that last vestige of the 26th Wisconsin that we have been talking about since we were over at the Hawkins farm. They sit slightly in front of the main Bushbeck line. Now, we've been talking about the incredible resistance that has been put up along this front. We've talked about Jackson having a tremendous amount of success up to this moment. Where is Stonewall Jackson during all of this? Jackson is physically located up on the turnpike. He is staying on the road, he is staying mobile, he is interacting with the battle along the highway. But as you turn around, you will be unable to see that highway, and Jackson would be unable to see you. He certainly wouldn't be able to fathom what was going on in the woods or penetrate into there to see his own troops or the resistance out there. So the troops out there, what kind of direction are they getting? None. Now, Stonewall Jackson has been a notorious officer for keeping all reins of power in his own hands. He's been a micromanager. He has been extremely, excessively secretive. He doesn't share his plans with his immediate subordinates. He has been steeped deeply in the Napoleonic tradition of pure secrecy, even to the point where he boldly steals a lot of their maxims and tries to make them his own. The Duke of Wellington allegedly was once asked about secrecy, and he said that if my hair knew my plans, I would shave it off and wear a wig. Jackson was caught saying that if my coat knew my plans, I would throw it away and wear another. It's not quite as pithy as the Duke of Wellington, but we can see easily where he drew his inspiration. This day, though, Jackson is not secretive. Jackson would talk to his subordinates. They will understand his mindset, his plan, his ideas, and exactly what he's trying to achieve. So they're going to know their commander's intent. They're going to know his objectives. They know that when they attack at 5:15 that night, they are supposed to not only crush the end of the Union line, which in their perception is still the flank of the entire Union Army, without realizing that they had managed to get behind the Union Army and were striking their rear. His one and only objective after that was to seize the high ground by the Tally Farm, which is opposite Hawkins. And we saw what that firefight was just across the valley. Once they achieved that, they don't know anything about any of the ground beyond it. So at this point, everything is predicated on being adaptive, analytical, and exploitive. All the Confederates off in the woods are under the impression that if there is any resistance met along the corridor of the highway, they're supposed to bypass it and then turn its flank or threaten its rear to crush its resistance. If you can cut them off, you can capture them. If you can hit them in the flank, you can crush them. Every commander out there understands that concept. That's vitally important because Jackson's not going to make decisions out here. They are. When the Federals put up a stout resistance on the Bushbeck line, several Confederate brigades are stymied. They're stopped dead in their tracks. You heard from Beth that they've lost brigade commanders. They're losing leadership. The men are exhausted. The Confederates are going to rally and regroup back in those woods and try it again, but this time with much more calculation to it. There are going to be 4 Confederate brigades that are going to charge across that meadow and engage this line yet again with the understanding that they are keeping the Federals preoccupied while 2 brigades of North Carolinians and Louisianans are able to bypass this point and turn the position, either capture it or crush it, or both. On the other side of the highway, closer to Jackson, they're hoping to do precisely the same thing, this time with a brigade of Georgians and a brigade of North Carolinians. The only problem is those troops on the other side of the highway aren't there yet. The lead element is led by a general named Alfred Colquitt from Georgia. He is a very, very capable politician, but not nearly as gifted as a military man. As he advances in the forefront, his right flank south of the highway is wide open. That made him somewhat excessively cautious. Anticipating that, the orders given out were that he was supposed to ignore any threat to his flank, and that the second or the third lines behind him would pick up anything that tried to interdict him. That was the order, but as it was, Alfred Colquitt didn't buy into it. As he advanced, he was advancing into arguably some of the more difficult terrain of the wilderness. Everything drops off on the other side of the highway. It goes into a series of swamps and watersheds. The ground is very broken up. There's very little of a visual to be able to see. But somewhere out there, he convinced himself he saw a major threat looming towards his flank. And he abruptly stopped dead in his tracks and sent out skirmishers to investigate. That was not his job. The brigade behind him, as a result, was stopped, and the men behind them were stopped, dead in their tracks. The second line was led by a brigadier named Dodson Ramseur, who immediately jogged forward, reminded Colquitt of the orders, told him to press on. If there was a threat, it was Dodson Ramseur's problem, not Colquitt's. Colquitt was dogmatic. He refused to listen to the other brigadier. He continued to explore the woods. He didn't find anybody. Later on, he convinced himself that maybe he had been looking at the skirmish line for the 11th Corps and that they had somehow managed to cut off part of their picket or picket reserve. Those men then managed to seep into the darkness, disappear down the creek, and get away. So that by the time others came to investigate his front, there was nobody there. The other possibility is that there are Confederates down on the Plank Road, about a mile below us at this point, and that is Elijah Franklin Paxton's Stonewall Brigade. And somehow, perhaps, he had actually seen friendly units and confounded them for the enemy. As whatever the case or the situation might be, the danger had abated. Cal Colquitt could move forward, and then everybody behind him could as well. But in the course of just a couple of minutes, they have already about a half mile behind the rest of the advance. So in this one critical moment, literally in the open gambit of the flank attack, the entire right wing of Jackson's flank attack has been shorn off by the obstinacy of one brigadier who was afraid of what was ever in the woods to his right front. It's going to be a while for them to catch up. Meanwhile, people over here are completely and utterly oblivious to that. Jackson on the highway is oblivious to that. So there is no rhyme or reason to expect these men to know different. As the battle continues to surge and rage and or explode all around us, the North Carolina Brigade of Alfred Iverson is going to hit that little rise and run into the 82nd Illinois. Good timing. And the 26th Wisconsin. And those units who have already been terribly manhandled, brutalized, and beaten are going to be swept off that little rise and driven right back through this small meadow where we are now. As they come peeling past us, Carolinians are going to come charging out of the woods and strike at the very end of this hill, strike at the very end of the Bushbeck line. Coming up the slope, the commander of the 12th North Carolina is going to go down. When he goes down, that creates a tremendous problem in the high command of this regiment because he was the only field officer in the entire regiment. When he goes down, there is nobody to direct the 12th North Carolina. There is nobody with a commission. They're going to be in the hands of the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, for the next couple hours until they can bring in a ringer to take over. And eventually a man named Robert D. Johnston is going to be funneled over from one of the other regiments. He will become their colonel de facto for the rest of the battle. It's a good choice, actually. They've done well for themselves. R.D. Johnston is going to be soon elevated to a commission as a brigadier general. So already people understand that he has leadership capabilities, qualities, and can even inspire and move those men that have no knowledge of him. Just by his presence, he can come into a group of strangers, take over, and lead them into battle.
We had a question if this property is still owned by the Hawkins family.
All right, so not to ignore the question, but to keep on going with what we have for the moment. We have an attack that's alive. Carolinians are going to be charging up this slope directly towards you. Most of the Union forces are facing to the west. So the end of this line has been flanked yet again. When they face to the south, Confederates attack from the west. When the Union line faces to the west, the Confederates attack from the north and drive south, but always harrying that end of the Union line. Right behind them is going to be a Louisiana brigade that's going to come out to your right front that now threatens to come in directly behind the Bushbeck line. This is the brigade of General Francis Nichols. North Carolinians are Alfred Iverson's men. These are stalwart troops, and they know when they have a clear advantage. Attacking up a slope like this is a disadvantage. Attacking against the end of a line that is not facing you is a very clear advantage. And once you get up to the top of that hill, you own this part of the battlefield. It's easy to understand when soldiers like C.W. McKay of the 154th New York Right, we stayed until it would have been madness to have remained longer. Lieutenant Dana P. Horton of the 154th wrote, "The Rebs were so close on us that we had to run for our sweet lives at that point." So this end of the line breaks and they start rolling. The Confederates are going to exploit that and keep pressing to see if they can't capture whatever lies between us and the highway. The rest of the Bushbeck line is going to be compromised, but also what you've heard from Beth is that there is artillery on this line. There's an Ohio battery under Captain Hubert Dilger, Old Leather Breeches Dilger, and that is a tempting prize that will lure these men in this direction rather than pursue in that direction. What is going to ensue is an interesting little firefight. We're going to just step a little further over this direction and take a look at that firefight before we launch into the woods.
How come the Union commanders, don't they realize that the Confederate lines are extending beyond?
Just a matter of a few yards makes all the difference in this battle. If you look off towards the north, you can see the tree line. That is the highway, and that is exactly where Battery I of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery is located. Captain Hubert Dilger and Dilger's men have been blasting away furiously down the highway towards the Wilderness Church. They are a tempting target for all the Confederates along the road. All of them have been coming at it. They have been blasted back in wave after wave, succession after succession. But once again, the Confederates, according to the artillerist, merely close ranks and drive towards them again. Beth did a marvelous job in telling us about this furious exchange between Dilger and the Confederate infantry, Dilger against Confederate artillery. According to one Confederate, he said that this entire ground was just filled with bodies, and that the Confederates had lost some too, but they piled up particularly around the artillery. Well, the only substantial defense was immediately out here in front of you. So this is one of those killing fields that really starts to hurt the Confederates. Dilger's men are going to fight their guns to the last. As this entire line starts to cave in, according to at least one artillerist with the beautifully, euphoniously pleasing name of Darwin Dianthus Cody. He said that the North Carolinians started to close in, the line started to collapse, and the infantry left them. And they were to fight alone. At that point, unchecked, North Carolinians were able to close in along this slope, and probably from very close to where we are, open fire on the battery with small arms and kill their horses, attempting to immobilize them so that they could not escape. Captain Gilbert's horse went down with the captain on top. He was able to jump free unscathed and keep on commanding. But eventually, as these Confederates started to close in from all sides, it was time for even him to escape. He had to abandon several of his guns simply because he didn't have the horses to do it. He kept one gun himself in the road and fired it, and every time it recoiled, he would back up with the gun. It was a retreat by recoil, and he became, in essence, the rear guard of the 11th Corps. Several of the guns were indeed abandoned, but in fact, Darwin Dianthus Cody had been wrong. They had not been completely abandoned by their infantry. Members of the 74th Pennsylvania were able to successfully fight, save, and extract 2 of those guns and return them to Dilger. Dilger himself is the last real known resistance. As he backs off from here, that impresses everyone, and in fact, he will earn the Medal of Honor for his determined stand here along the Bushbeck line, and as the rear guard that buys time for the rest of the Army of the Potomac to somehow, some way, adjust to this unexpected flank attack, which in essence is really a turning movement that has struck the rear and has jeopardized the Union Army. From this point, you have walked almost the entire length of the Union 11th Corps position. You have gone from their far right with Devon's division. You have gone to the Hawkins Farm with Schurtz's division, and you have been at the Bushbeck line with von Steinwehr's division. And when they collapse, you lose this high ground beside you. The division no longer exists. The Corps no longer survives. It is a broken mass. And as they run across this meadow, heading towards the woods beyond, the Confederates will blaze into them and tear them apart. The 154th New York claimed that they lost more men in this meadow beside us, trying to get away from the Bushbeck line, than they lost defending the line itself. And that speaks volumes. There were probably about 1,500 Federals that held this line. Over a third of them never left this line. Some have speculated that the 11th Corps stood here for up towards an hour, and that's probably wishful thinking. It probably felt like hours, but in truth, they probably fought about 20 minutes in the intensive combat. The resistance is broken. The Corps does not exist. From here on out, it turns into a running battle. There is no major stands. When you're relying on Dilger and a gun to be your rear guard, there is no one else to make that stand. It's very, very fluid at this point. And we're going to become very fluid as well. The Confederate resistance, or the Confederate attack, I should say, has also become tremendously disorganized as a result of pursuing these Federal troops and breaking their resistance, taking them off of von Gilsa's line, taking them off of the Hawkins Farm, taking them off the Bushbeck line. Every time we've talked about Confederates coming in from the flanks. And when a unit comes in from the flank, it's virtually impossible to turn them around and shut them right back out to the flank. It's impossible to keep this line up. So when Jackson started this attack with a 2-mile front, when we get to this point, it's little better than a mile front. From here on out, it's going to get shorter and shorter still. It's going to have a pencil point effect to the point where we get to the high water mark. There's only about 500 yards of Confederates that mark the front. And everyone else is now streaming behind them in column, if necessary. Others are going to be completely disorganized and discombobulated units. They find their commanders after the Bushbeck line. They don't know where to look for direction. Commanders themselves don't know where their men have vanished onto this intractable sea of men and forest. So they will just simply assert themselves over any command that comes into their field of influence. This, folks, is the last of the real resistance. This is the last of the big time fighting. But that doesn't mean that there isn't fighting itself to be encountered as we continue on with this hike of ours. From here on out, there's going to be just a couple of stops till we reach our high water mark. But this is where we enter into the woods. This is where we go into no man's land. This is where we're going to take a tour that's never gone anywhere before. We're going to be inventing our way through the wilderness. Beth Parnicza is going to be a genuine pathfinder for us out here. You've had a chance to walk about halfway out. That means that we've done a mile out. There's only another mile to go. But that's the wrong way to look at this. We're only 1/4 of the way through our experience. Because you have to go another mile out through woods and another mile back through woods before you get to this point and get a mile to walk back to your cars. So we got 4 miles in a round trip. We've only covered 1/4 of the way. So if you have any doubts, this is the point of no return. If you want to go back, our volunteers will be more than happy to escort you back. I believe we have one of our volunteers in the back who will be happy to, there you go, with his arm up in the air. He'd be more than happy to take you back across the Hawkins Farm towards your cars. Otherwise, if you're in with us, you're in for the duration. There is no turning back at this point. Now, there was a question raised before we start out if this was part of the Hawkins Farm. It is not. This was a piece of property that belonged to the Wagner family. It now belongs to the Civil War Trust. When we went into the meadow and Beth was talking about Howard rallying the troops, And that's when you entered into the Civil War Trust Wagner tract. The tract in between Gold Run and that meadow is actually a sliver of ground that belongs to the National Park Service. Where we're going right now is into another piece of private property. It's called the Bins property. It is a piece of property that I dare say only 3 historians have ever penetrated ever. And we've got 2 of them today. So we're going to be heading in there in just a moment. Again, the point of no return. So you have to seriously think about where you are right now and what you want to do.
What time is it on the evening of May 2nd?
Question raised about the original tree lines. This is pretty accurate to what you would have had in the wartime, including the meadow beside us, the last day of the fire.
What time is it?
Hey everybody!
How light is it?
What time is it on May 2nd?
Made a very imposing obstacle of these woods. One element of these woods is that we are probably going to have to lead you through them. So we love your enthusiasm, and we love that for the most part, you all have known where you're going. And just like the 11th Corps, have been able to find your way to this point. But we don't want to lose any of you. If we take casualties on this tour, Frank and I have to do a lot of paperwork. So, please follow our lead as we go throughout the woods. As we go through the woods, as Frank mentioned, this is private property. So please also be aware we are going to pass some glass bottles, some other sort of landmarks, for lack of a better term, as we go through. Please do not pick up the glass bottles. Please watch where you step, and just be overarchingly aware and very careful as we go forward. All right, thank you. How many along that line could have truthfully and heartily endorsed the sentiment? Is it not pride of character, after all, more than anything else, that makes us passable soldiers? So we're often pressed with the question, what makes a man go forward? When they order the attack, what compels someone to actually advance into it? What would compel you to go forward through a tangle of woods like this, besides me telling you to? Fear, promise of success, your reputation, sacred honor, someone said adventure. It's going to take a lot to get many of these men to go forward, but they continue to go forward. But again, the scene, even as they press onward, is chaos and confusion. One man, Thomas Cook, who's actually a New York Herald correspondent, wrote, on the one hand was a solid column of infantry retreating at a double quick from the face of the enemy. On the other was a dense mass of beings who had lost their reasoning faculties and were flying from 1,000 fancied dangers. Battery wagons, ambulances, horses, men, cannon, caissons, all jumbled and tumbled together in an apparently inextricable mass, and that murderous fire still pouring in upon them. Scene of chaos here, with a whole lot of different elements and moving parts put into it. Horses, men, cannon, caissons, as he tells us. The men are soon going to run through these woods, jumping ahead of us, about to where Frank will be talking to us next. But they'll pour through these woods, and the 11th Corps will encounter the rest of the Union Army. What's the rest of the Union Army going to do? Well, certainly they'll scorn the 11th Corps for running. That's not what soldiers are supposed to do. But they'll try to stop the rout. How can they get the 11th Corps to stop and rally? Cavalryman John Collins wrote as he saw the 11th Corps come in through his lines. The flank road, at the modern-day Route 3, and the woods that bordered it, presented a scene of terror and confusion, such as I had never seen before. Men and animals were dashing against one another in wild dismay before the line of fire that came crackling and crashing after them. The constantly approaching rattle of musketry, the crash of the shells through the trees, seemed to come from 3 sides upon the broken fragments of the 11th Corps that had crowded each other on the road. Some officers in the main body of the Army will attempt to stop the running 11th Corps. But there's little that can be done. When you're possessed with a certain terror, that if you don't keep running, you're going to be killed, that terror seems to hold. Some will be turned back at the point of a bayonet. Other officers use more inventive means. But it's a difficult task. Sergeant Rice Fool of the 123rd New York wrote, their retreat was headlong. They had thrown away everything that was loose. Nothing could stop them. We were ordered to stop them, but we might as well have tried to stop a cyclone. They dived through our line, regardless of our guns or bayonets. One can hardly conceive of the terror that possessed them. Will brings up the key to all of this. One can hardly conceive of the terror that possessed them. These men are running for their lives. They simply could not hold. They got all mixed up. They lost their units. They're lost in the woods. The woods are dense. They're confusing. They're intimidating. It just played on their already frightened minds. Have any of you ever been lost in the woods? I know I have. Show of hands. Who's been lost in the woods? All right, how does that feel?
Bad.
Not good. Bad, as someone put extremely simply right next to me. You know that little twinge of fear that you get when you start to think you're lost? Crap, where are we going? Add to that little twinge of fear the knowledge that there are thousands of men running right behind you that have already driven you out of all of your positions to this point, and their sole goal on this earth at this moment is to shoot and kill you. And then you might have an inkling of the kind of terror that possessed these men to the point that to try to stop them, well, you might as well try to stop a cyclone. And these woods played a crucial role in that fear. With that said, I'm going to hope desperately that we are not lost in the woods. And look, I think Frank is behind us.